go through things. All right. So we're going to get started. So thank you everyone for joining us on Easter Sunday. So happy Easter to everyone. This is our first online, so hopefully this will go well. I'm going to run it like I do the usual. So we'll do some introductory slides and then I'll hand it over to Christine. So we did a practice run, so I think it'll go well. For questions, if you can put your questions in the chat through Zoom, and then I'm going to try to grab them all and moderate them at the end. We're also streaming live on YouTube. I doubt I'll be able to monitor the questions on YouTube at the same time, but I'll try. But so if anyone's on YouTube and they want to ask a question, you might be better off joining the Zoom. So let's get started. So I'm honored to have Christine join us from the Financial Times talking about data journalism. We postponed this a couple times because of COVID, but hopefully this will go well. I'm pretty excited. So let's just go through and do our introductory slides real quick. So our sponsors continue to support us. They're really helping and making this possible. Everyone's kind of operating, the best they can right now. So there's a lot of changes going on, but I think that all the sponsors would still be eager to talk to anybody that's interested in learning more about their companies. So Variant Technologies has sponsored us for a long time. They're a defense contractor, always looking for quality talent, software engineers, and data scientists. Let's see. So Clarity is another small business. They do defense contracting, who also are looking for software talent if anyone's interested. ICF is a newer sponsor. They're actually pretty large. They're a publicly traded 7,000 person company. They actually have a lot of interesting work, including work in the San Francisco area. So if you're looking for something that's pretty diverse, I would say get in touch with them. Any of the sponsors, if you're interested in any of them, you can contact me and I can make an introduction. And then Aries Ventures, that's my company. So we're a smaller software shop doing federal contracting. So if you're interested, you can talk to me. I am going to try to do a couple more virtual meetups. So I'm working on trying to get one discussing blockchain, one discussing open source, and one discussing data ingest pipelines. So stay tuned. It takes a little bit to coordinate these, but if everything goes smooth, we'll try to do another one. And then with that, I'm going to hand over to Christine. She recently joined the Financial Times. You can read a lot of her work online. I've put links into the meetup so you can see her byline and some of her recent work. So with that, I'm going to hand it over screen sharing responsibilities. So I think you can just take it, Christine.
Okay. So everyone can hear me, right?
Yes.
Okay, so let me just do my screen share. This is the only the second time I've presented something on Zoom, so bear with me. Okay, here we go. Okay. All right, there we go. Well, hi everybody. As Jason mentioned, my name is Christine. Thank you so much for tuning into my presentation today. And thanks to Jason for organizing this and for bearing with me through rescheduling and such. I also know that it's a holiday weekend, so I'm very grateful that you were all able to make it. So currently I'm working at the Financial Times. I was hired to be the US elections data journalist for the FT right at the end of February, which has certainly been an interesting journey thus far as coronavirus has really taken over all aspects of daily life, including the elections. But before that, I worked as a data journalist at the Baltimore Sun, and my previous job in journalism prior to the Sun was on the LA Times data desk in 2016, which of course was another notable election year. But what is data journalism anyway? I like to start my talks about data journalism this way because I often find that when I tell people that I'm a data journalist or a data reporter, whether they're a source that I'm talking to for a story or a friend of a friend in casual conversations, they'll always ask me a follow-up question along the lines of, what is that? I've never heard of it. And I think it's a question that I doubt I'd get if, for example, I introduced myself as a crime reporter or a political journalist. And it's probably not their fault that they don't know what data journalism is. After all, the term data journalism is pretty recent, at least according to this one search on Google Trends I did a few years back. But I bet, especially nowadays, you see examples of data journalism every day. As the coronavirus pandemic continues to spread and disrupt everyday life, data and graphics teams in news organizations, big and small, are working to communicate the trajectory of the disease, whether that's on a global level. Here is a chart that's updated daily by my colleagues at the Financial Times data team in London. On a national level, these are some similar charts that are also updated regularly by the New York Times of metro areas. Or on a local level, this is from the Baltimore Sun, a series of charts, again, updated daily, that reflect coronavirus in Maryland and the different counties. But before coronavirus took over our lives and changed everything, I would argue that data journalism was, I think, more often associated with elections, maybe even most often associated with elections, specifically polls and forecasts of who would win. And I saw this a lot in 2016 and afterwards. A lot of people said, because Trump won the election, this was some kind of indictment of data journalism, like as if data journalism was all wrong just because some of the state level polls were not very accurate. And people just associated data journalism exclusively with polls and election forecasts. And part of that is because a major contributing factor for the rise of the term data journalist was when Nate Silver, who became famous for forecasting the 2008 and 2012 elections with great accuracy, turned his blog into a media company called 538 in 2014. But if you look at 538's own so-called manifesto, where Silver explained his goals for the site, they don't describe data journalism as being all about election predictions. The opposite, in fact. Instead, they talk about collecting data, organizing data, exploring data, etc. Basically, what I feel like are the methods of social scientists applied to journalism. And that same philosophy was expressed by The Upshot from the New York Times, which was established as their data journalism hub in 2014 as well. I mentioned 2014 a lot because, on a personal note, 2014 was when I became first aware of the term. And seeing the prominence of sites like 538 and The Upshot in part inspired me to work in this field. At that time, I was in Washington, D.C., working as a research analyst at a think tank. And I had zero experience in journalism, but a lot of experience in data. Kind of embarrassed to show this next slide, but I dressed up like this for Halloween, for instance. This was in DC in 2014. Like, I actually went to work like this, right? And people didn't even think that it was a Halloween costume. They're just like, oh, you just came as yourself. Because I'm really nerdy. But that's when I first thought, like, I love telling stories with data. I want to be a data journalist. I want to bring together social science research methods, like I was doing at the think tank and before, together with journalism, just like all of these other journalists at 538 and The Upshot, et cetera, were doing. I thought that data journalism was this cool new thing. Well, here's a life lesson. When you think that you've invented something or thought of something new, chances are someone else has thought of it before. Of course, data journalism was a thing before 2014. Journalists have long used data in their work. And in the 90s, computers made it possible to do more with larger databases. Back then, the practice was called, quote unquote, computer-assisted reporting. Here's a program from the 1993 NICAR conference. NICAR stands for the National Institute for Computer-Assisted Reporting. It's now known as one of the biggest data journalism conferences every year. This year it was held in New Orleans, where more than 1,000 people attended, including myself. But of course, everything is quote unquote computer assisted now, including this talk today. So the term computer assisted reporting is a bit obsolete. Philip Meyer, who had been doing sophisticated data reporting since the 1960s, called the practice precision journalism in the 1999 anthology When Nerds and Words Collide, which if you're looking for some fun quarantine reading, I highly recommend. But I'm not here to give you a lesson in etymology. You know, there are a lot of terms to describe data journalists and what we do. I'm going to use the term data journalist just because it's easy, but there's a lot of different classifications floating around. And some might say the best phrase to describe what people like me do in the news industry is quote unquote news nerdery. The point is, and if you take away nothing else from this talk, make it this: as far as data journalism is concerned, the practice has existed for far longer than the term. I realize that I haven't yet given you a precise definition of the type of work that we news nerds do. To me, the aspects of data journalism, gathering data, analyzing it, and presenting it are the same fundamentals of good research and thoughtful analysis, just applied to news stories. And I'll show you what I mean using historical examples alongside contemporary examples and some examples from my own work. Let's start with gather. One early pioneer of data journalism was the Chicago-based investigative journalist Ida B. Wells in 1895. For those of you who live in Baltimore, you may know of the restaurant Ida B's Table, which is named after her. Since the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, there had been increasing rates of lynchings of Black men in the South. The predominant narrative at the time was that these were carried out to avenge assaults on women by Black men. Ida B. Wells used data to reveal that in actuality, Black men were lynched for reasons like not giving way to whites, competing economically with them, nonviolent misdemeanors, and sometimes for no reason at all. To do this, Wells compiled data, mainly from newspaper reports like this one from the Chicago Tribune, detailing specific lynchings and what the men who were lynched were accused of. In 1895, she published the Red Record, tabulated statistics and alleged causes of lynching in the United States. This is known as one of the main sources of data that showed that lynching was being used not as a form of criminal punishment, but a form of social control. Another team that compiled records was the Boston Globe's Spotlight team in the 2000s, whose news investigation of Catholic Church sexual abuse scandals was made into a movie that won the Best Picture Oscar in 2016. In their investigations, the Spotlight team searched through printed church directories to see what happened to priests who were accused of sexual abuse. The data suggested a pattern that church leaders were shuttling the clergymen from parish to parish or putting them on sick leave rather than addressing the child molestation charges. Let's take a moment to appreciate this scene, which I think is the only scene in a movie that makes a spreadsheet look exciting. Clearly, this is why it won the Oscar, right? But anyway, this research led the team to widen the scope of its investigation. The Boston Globe had already been publishing news stories on sexual abuse by the church, but as discrete events rather than as a systematic issue. Just like Ida B. Wells took separate news stories of lynchings and made them into a statistical account, the Spotlight team gathered the information on specific people and events to establish evidence of a pattern of abuse. Today, a crucial aspect of any data journalist's job remains gathering information and creating a database that can be served up to the public. For example, when I worked at the Baltimore Sun, the data team worked together with the crime reporters to create this page of homicides in Baltimore. The reporters gather the information from police advisories and reports, and more often than not, are at the scene of the homicides after they occur to verify the online reports. Gathering this information into a database for the public to explore not only provides a complete, or as complete as possible, accounting of the more than 300 murders the city experiences every year, but it also allows for comparisons of the current trajectory of homicides to that of previous years. In a city with one of the highest murder rates in the country, I believe it is a crucial public service to compile this information. And that's partially why the Baltimore Sun continues to do so today. Another form of gathering information that you've probably seen some version of this year involves election results. Here, for instance, is the Financial Times delegate tracker, which gathers information from the Associated Press on how many delegates each Democratic presidential candidate has won, and serves it up on a results page that is updated every time there is a primary or caucus in a state. Like with the homicides page, the delegate tracker involves reporters gathering information and data from trusted sources and creating a news story from the resulting database. Of course, it's not just about collecting data, it's about what you do with it. Here I have another 19th century example of data journalism in the form of Horace Greeley. So Horace Greeley was the editor of the New York Tribune, and during his time as editor, Greeley produced an investigative data story that involved both the gathering and the analysis of some data. He asked one of his reporters, who had been a former postal clerk, to use a US Post Office book of mail routes to calculate the shortest path from each congressman's district to the Capitol, and compared those distances with each congressman's mileage reimbursements. So this calculation may seem trivial today. You could probably do it on a computer or calculator pretty quickly. But back then he described it as, quote, a computation involving over 500,000 of figures and executed in a very brief space of time. Greeley then used these calculations to accuse Abraham Lincoln, among many others, of taking too much money for mileage to and from the Capitol. Here you can see, it's a little hard to see because it's so small, but you can see a table which was published on the story in the New York Tribune, listing each congressman's name and the excess miles the analysis showed that they were charging. Similarly, a lot of my job at the Sun involved analyzing data that had already been gathered and putting it into context. For example, in this story with crime reporter Jessica Anderson this year, I analyzed data we had received in response to a public records request about police overtime to figure out the hours and overtime individual officers were averaging per week. The officer who racked up the most overtime, Sergeant Ethan Newberg, was also the highest paid city employee in fiscal year 2019. As the story notes, Sergeant Newberg's overtime totals would have been even higher had he not been suspended in June on charges of misconduct, assault, and false imprisonment. I should also note that for this and most data stories, I made an effort to put that data and the code that I use to analyze it, which I usually did in R, on the Baltimore Sun data team's GitHub page, which is linked above. So I definitely encourage you to check it out if you're interested in more of the details of how we reached the numbers in our stories. So you'll notice now that data analysis stories often involve some sort of presentation. In the case of the police overtime story, a bar chart, and in the case of Horace Greeley's investigative report, a table. So these categories of gather, analyze, and present are obviously quite fluid, but I think that the next example does a good job of showing what I mean in terms of combining analysis and presentation. In 1989, Bill Dedman received the Pulitzer Prize for investigative reporting for The Color of Money, a series of articles in 1988 published in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution on racial discrimination by banks and other mortgage lenders in middle-income Black neighborhoods. Dedman's analysis of home loans data revealed a lending gap in Atlanta that is best illustrated by these maps on the right. The top map highlights where 50% or more of the population is Black, areas in Atlanta where that's the case. And the bottom map shows that those same areas are often areas where banks rarely lended. The concept of side-by-side or top-to-bottom maps is often used by data journalists today to show geographical correlations between variables. In Baltimore, it is most often to highlight disparities that have persisted along racial lines, often a legacy of historical racist policies. Some of you may have heard of the white L and the black butterfly, a concept popularized in this passage by Professor Lawrence Brown. So this map is actually from the Urban Institute. The pink dots on the map represent white residents living in Baltimore areas that people call the white L. And the blue dots represent Black residents who live in areas known as the quote unquote black butterfly. And if you see this racial pattern, many social, economic, and quality of life variables also fall along these lines, including things like loan volume and vacant houses and persistently vacant houses, child support debt, and child poverty. On this map, the highest poverty areas are shaded in Black, and the public schools with the lowest ratings from the Department of Education, the 1-star rating out of 5, are the red dots that are plotted on top, often in those same areas. As you can see, data visualization can be very powerful because it allows one to see relationships that would otherwise be invisible. So let's go back in time again to the 1850s amid another public health crisis, the cholera epidemic in London. John Snow, a British doctor, believed that water contaminated by sewage was the cause of cholera. That was contrary to the popular belief at the time that the disease was spread through bad air. Snow published papers and essays, but couldn't convince most people of his theory. So he took to collecting data on where cholera deaths were occurring, and he created this map. So the red dots are where water pumps were in London, and the black dots were, each black dot, I believe, represents a death from cholera. So as the map shows, this is the Broad Street pump, and a lot of the deaths were concentrated around the Broad Street pump. And it made the argument that the Broad Street water pump was the source of the problem. And it turns out that pump was built near a cesspit. And so soon after he showed his analysis along with this map, it was removed. John Snow wasn't a journalist by profession, but he used a lot of the same tools to the same end, visualizing relationships that wouldn't otherwise be apparent. This extremely detailed map of the 2016 presidential election from the New York Times does just that. By visualizing election results by precinct, the map allows its audience to discover things like voter islands, enclaves of blue or red that stand in contrast to their neighbors in extraordinary detail. On a smaller scale, for the 2018 gubernatorial election in Maryland, I also visualized precinct level election results on a map for the Baltimore Sun. By making it interactive, the audience could explore their own neighborhoods and find out how many votes went for the Republican incumbent governor, Larry Hogan, versus his Democratic challenger, Ben Jealous. But election maps are notoriously tricky, not only because it's hard to get all of the data in the first place and in the right format. You'll notice that this extremely detailed map of the 2016 election, if you click on the story, it was published in 2018 because that may have been how long it took to compile all those records and verify the results. But it is also a challenge to figure out how to responsibly represent that data. For example, here is a Twitter thread by my friend John Schlois, a former LA Times graphics reporter, who took issue with the fact that the New York Times map does not adjust for population density. So he showed, for example, the LA Times version of the map for the Bakersfield, California area. In the LA Times version of the map, the suburbs around Bakersfield, California are shaded with less opacity than the city itself because they are less populated. To take a more concrete example, say that a precinct contained just 5 voters, 4 of them who voted for Trump. So that would be an 80% vote share for Trump. But does that mean that this precinct should be shaded in the darkest shade of red? Or is that somewhat misleading because it implies a greater number of votes than is the case? So, you know, the answer to this question is the key to this debate over whether or not to adjust for population density in election results. But to be fair, here's a response to John's critique by Josh Katz, one of the creators of the map. He said, in part, if you want to count who won the most votes, using opacity makes sense. But if you're interested in the political character of a place, reducing the visual weight of low population places, literally making them hard to see, suggests those places aren't worth caring about. So his point was that because the map had come out in 2018, most people already knew, you know, the result of the election, obviously, as well as some of the more nuanced things about population density. And the point wasn't to make that kind of representative view, but rather to allow people to zoom in on specific geographical areas. So I'm not here to say who is right or who's wrong. That's not the point of this. Like, the point is that being a data journalist also means making these kinds of decisions on how to show data, where sometimes, honestly, the right answer just depends on the context. I think that both of these people have really, really good arguments for the way that they created each of their maps. And sometimes there really is no right answer. I certainly thought about how to visualize election results a lot when making election maps in 2018. And I'm sure I'll continue to spend many hours thinking of them this year. But back in 2018, here were 4 ways I thought about visualizing election results by precinct. This uses the Anne Arundel County executive race in Maryland as an example. The top left map here is a simple heat map where the shades correspond exactly to the vote share of the winner, kind of like the New York Times precinct map. Darker shades of red or blue mean a higher percentage of the vote for the Republican or Democratic candidate, respectively. The top right map adjusts the opacity of the shading for population density. Now, this is kind of like that LA Times map. Then there are the dot maps. The bottom left one puts a red or blue dot on each precinct to represent the winner, with the size corresponding to the margin of victory. The bottom right dot map does the same thing, but the size of the dot corresponds to the votes per square mile to take into account population. So you can see how this gets complicated pretty quickly. And there are trade-offs to each of these approaches. In case you're curious, for the Anne Arundel County executive race in the end, we decided to go with the top left map, the simplest version. It doesn't adjust for population, but we thought the readers of the Capitol, where the map appeared, the county's local newspaper and a sister paper of the Sun, would be familiar enough with their local geography to recognize sparsely populated areas. Plus, as a practical matter, it's apparently really hard to print dot maps onto a physical newspaper, even though I personally would say that those were my favorites. Here's another example of the different ways to present similar information. This chart, which I made for the Financial Times in March, uses data from OpenTable to show that restaurant reservations were declining across US cities, even before some of those cities moved restaurants to carry out and delivery only, and issued stay-at-home orders. So I was pretty proud of myself for having found this data set and visualized the trend using a line chart, which I thought was quite compelling. But the same day that the article came out, I saw that 2 other outlets had essentially done the same thing. So News at Northeastern is on the top left. They used a heat map to visualize different countries' restaurant reservations going to red, signifying a year-on-year decline in reservations on OpenTable. And 538, which was below that, used bar charts to show this same trend in different states. So this is like the heat map, line chart, bar chart trifecta here. And I'll leave you to decide which one is the most effective. But this just shows that just as different reporters can come up with different angles on a given topic, different data journalists who are working with essentially the same or similar data sets can come up with different data visualizations and analyses. So not to plug my current employer, but you know, it gets overwhelming sometimes, all these different chart types. And if you'd like a starting point for a taxonomy of the different kinds of data visualizations that you can make, the Financial Times a while back created a great resource called the Visual Vocabulary, designed to help data journalists decide which visualizations to use to achieve their goals. And I found it pretty useful, like even before I was working there. So I definitely encourage you to check it out. But you know, data journalism doesn't have to be this complicated thing. Not all fancy charts are good charts. Sometimes it's just about presenting data in a way that makes them more compelling than, say, a table full of numbers. Data from polls are a great example of this. The Financial Times partners with the Peterson Foundation to conduct a nationwide poll every month that tracks US voter sentiment about the economy and more ahead of the 2020 election. And part of my job is to help create a story every time new polling numbers come out. And one of the questions that was asked in the poll last month was, are you more concerned about the impact of the coronavirus outbreak on public health or on the economy? And here's the crosstab by respondents' political party. This is a nice table, but I think that the chart version, which we used in the story, really illustrates more clearly the partisan divide in the answer to this question. Though most respondents said that they were more concerned about public health, Republicans were more likely than Democrats to say that they were more concerned about the economy. It's a relatively simple chart, but actually, again, I wanted to point out that I put a lot of thought into it. You might be wondering, for instance, why I didn't include the subgroup of voters who identified as independent or other on this chart. Well, if you go back and look at the data, you'll see that there were only 53 people surveyed in this group and who were asked that question, who were independents or others, which makes the margin of error on those estimates a bit too wide to responsibly show, in my opinion. You'll note as well that I calculated the margins of error for the Democrats and Republicans separately and listed them at the bottom of the chart. I wanted to make sure that the disparities by party didn't fall within the margin of error. Otherwise, it would be irresponsible to show them graphically. And by the way, that margin of error refers just to sampling error. There are many other sources of error and bias in polls. Sampling error is, for the most part, just a function of sample size. Besides, even if polls are perfectly conducted, they are, in the end, just snapshots in time. For example, in the FT Peterson poll that was conducted in February, respondents were asked whether they believed the spread of coronavirus would have an impact on the US economy. Most answered yes, but only a little. Now, in the same poll conducted in March, most answered yes, a lot, for a long time. So at their best, polls can only measure public sentiment at a given point in time, but people's opinions are bound to change, and rightfully so, as the world changes around them. So in this case, the visualizations might be simple, but the thought process behind them can get quite complicated. Indeed, how to responsibly report on polls is, I think, a question that keeps many data journalists, including myself, up at night, especially this year. So I hope that this presentation has given you an idea of what data journalism is and the long tradition that today's data journalists are following and continuing to improve upon. As I mentioned, these categories, gather, analyze, and present, are fluid. And the best data journalism stories often include all three of the aspects that I described. So I know I've shown a lot of sad and serious and frankly, sometimes depressing subject matter in this presentation. And I don't want you to think it's all doom and gloom. Data journalism is also about having fun with data. And I've been able to apply my skills in really interesting ways. Like this 2-page feature on Baltimore Ravens quarterback and 2019 NFL MVP Lamar Jackson, which I created for the Sun earlier this year. So I got to gather, analyze, and present all sorts of data on how truly unique and great a player he is. On the right are my 2 favorite charts from this analysis. And surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, this is to this day one of my favorite projects. And I'm saying this as someone who is not very knowledgeable about sports at all, and who even once wrote a blog post about how I don't know much about sports. Because the project is my favorite because it not only shows the value of data journalism, but it also underlines the importance of collaboration across the newsroom. Like I said, I'm not very knowledgeable about sports or really about the rules of football. And it was only with the help of my colleagues that I was even able to determine what kinds of data to gather in the first place and how to interpret them. Salaries data, for example, is really complicated, it turns out, with player contracts. Sometimes data journalism can feel like an island that's isolated within the newsroom. And maybe you have this impression that data journalists are just keeping their heads down, crunching numbers, and doing their own thing apart from the rest of the quote unquote traditional reporters. But I would argue that the best forms of data journalism, and perhaps most kinds of journalism, are about working on a team. So thank you again for taking part of your Sunday to listen to my talk. Please feel free to contact me if you have questions that don't get answered in the Q&A today. And if you're able to, I would urge you to please consider subscribing to your local paper or to the Financial Times, or if you can, financially, both. A lot of places, including the FT and the Sun, have made some of their coronavirus coverage free to read. But frankly, this pandemic is taking a huge economic toll on news organizations, big and small. If you want some data about this, above is a link to a spreadsheet of news industry layoffs and pay reductions compiled by the News Guild. So if you're looking for a way to help, I would encourage you to show your support by subscribing. So thank you again. And I think we can open it up to questions now.
Yeah, thank you, Christine. I have a number of questions. I've been gathering some and I had some ready. So I guess let's start off. I'd like to start with the beginning. What is your, I guess, normal approach to this, right? Do you come up with the idea for a story, or did they tell you the idea? And then how do you usually go about getting your data, and what is your editing process as you're creating the visualizations in the story?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I would say that it varies. Oftentimes I am coming up with an idea that I want to explore, and I think through the data points that I could gather to test those hypotheses or theories. But I think equally as much, a reporter might have a theory or an idea, or even like some data that they're not really sure what to do with, like the example of the overtime spreadsheet. And then I will help work with the reporter to understand what kinds of things are even possible to show, and how to responsibly show them. So it really depends on the story, but I would say that, like, I don't know. I don't really want to put a percentage to like how much of my time is about coming up with my own ideas versus working together with others on ideas. Um, but it is a bit of both.
So related to that, there was a question about, like, are you interacting with any graphic designers or anybody to help do the infographics, or do you handle that?
Yeah. So with the Lamar Jackson story, there is a designer at the Sun, Tracy Rawson, that I worked with to lay out this page. This project was a bit special in the sense that, you know, usually in this digital day and age, we think of kind of how our stories are going to look online, or especially on people's phones, which is the most common way of viewing the story. But this specific story, even though there is a online link to it below, was created intentionally for the print version of the newspaper. There was a special section on Lamar Jackson as the MVP, and on the Ravens. So she was really helpful in terms of figuring out how to design the graphics and lay them out on the page. And at the Financial Times, there is also there are also designers in London, and we have kind of design templates that help us work through different ways of presenting the data. I definitely don't want to say that I am a designer, because I'm not. My specialty, I guess, is more in terms of like thinking through, like, okay, how would I want to visualize this, or let me crunch the numbers in order to make the visualization possible. And so I'm really grateful to have the opportunity and ability to work with designers who think more about how to make graphics look good on the page in various ways.
That's a good answer. So you mentioned R. So what are some of the other tools that are, that you're using, or that you find some of your colleagues are using? Are you doing Python or Jupyter Notebooks? Can you go into some of those details?
Yeah, sure. So R is my preferred tool for doing things like data and statistical analysis. I use Python mostly for web scraping, but also sometimes I use the pandas library because I think it handles things like time series pretty well. Even though I have a love-hate relationship with pandas, kind of, as maybe a lot of people do. But yeah, so when I code in Python, I usually do it in Jupyter Notebooks because I find that is the most user-friendly thing that works for me. And actually, funnily enough, because I had kind of started learning Python in Jupyter Notebooks, I also for a period of time preferred using Jupyter Notebooks to share my analyses in R. Now I've moved to R Markdown, which does kind of a similar thing of presenting a document with your code and your graphs and stuff all in one place. So yeah, I think like R and Python are the main things that I use.
So kind of related, and maybe this is handled by some of the data graphics folks, but are there any, I think I'm understanding the question correctly. Is there any tools that you found that are useful for like interactive visualizations for the online websites, instead of just making like the stuff, but anything that people can, like, I guess when you were showing like the electoral map and you could zoom in, you select things.
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of like fancy tools to do interactives. A lot of people are are really good at D3. I'm not very good at D3, but like I would say for the Sun with the like maps that were interactive, usually I did them in CartoDB, so that election map was in Carto because the Sun had a subscription, a corporate kind of subscription to Carto, I should say. And we also, actually, during my time there, I pushed really hard for this to get we also had a subscription corporate account with Data Wrapper. That's DATAWRAPPER. Data Wrapper is a really great tool that allows you to make simple visualizations that can become interactive. So, I mean, I could probably just show an example of this. So this is like the Lamar Jackson graphic of his 2019 passes. And this I made in Data Wrapper. So like you can hover over each point. So the purple points are the passes that he completed. And I embedded some information on it, like the game and the date, and the team that they were playing, as well as the final score of the game. So I definitely encourage you to look at Data Wrapper. It's a great tool that helps create interactive data visualizations and get started. And actually, I should show you, let's see. Yeah, there's something called the Data Wrapper River. I promise I don't work for them or anything, though I have friends who do. But the Data Wrapper River is an example, has examples of charts that others have made in Data Wrapper. So if you clicked on these charts, you could see how they did it. It's actually usually pretty simple. You can upload a CSV or Excel spreadsheet or a Google sheet, and Data Wrapper will pick different kinds of visualizations that you can choose from.
Cool. So next question, I guess, is there's a lot of data. You're showing a lot of different data. So it's kind of a two-parter. One, like, how do you get your data? Like, is it a long process? Are you doing like freedom of information requests? Or are you just usually limited to the open data? And then there was a question as to how do you guys handle, I guess like the bar is kind of set a little higher for you guys in journalism. So how do you handle ensuring that like the data is credible and that it's validated? Is that something that's part of the process? Does it take longer? Things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a big challenge, especially with open data. With stuff at the Sun, I tried to use the Baltimore City Open Data Portal, but honestly, there aren't a lot of data sets on there that are very good. There's maybe like 3 data sets that you can trust. One of them being actually the Part 1 victim-based crimes data, which lists out like the most serious crimes committed by date and location. So we use that a lot to show things like patterns in shootings week by week, or understand like the answers to questions like when was the last weekend that Baltimore had no shootings at all. So I do use open data sometimes, and I'm a big fan of like the concept of open data, if not the practice. A lot of times, we have to use Freedom of Information Act requests and public records requests. The overtime story certainly was a result of that, as well as other stories that I've done that were more ambitious. So I worked with Yvonne Wenger, who is the poverty and social services reporter at the Sun. This was my last big project that I did before I left. I'm really grateful to have been able to work on it. And we had used a Freedom of Information request to get child support records from the Department of Health and Human Services for Maryland to understand where all of the child support debt in Maryland is distributed. And that kind of stuff, like, I would say public records requests are your best bet for getting that kind of information. Elections, just shifting gears a little bit, is a different story. At the Financial Times, like I mentioned, we have data from the FT Peterson poll, which is pretty cool because not only do we get like the top line and the crosstabs, but we also get like the individual level, respondent level data, anonymized, of course. And we get things, we're able to do things like every month ask a different set of well, there's like a core set of questions, but every month we can introduce another set of questions. But to address your second question about verifying, I think it was about verifying the accuracy of the data, or making sure that we're not presenting misleading information. I mean, it's really hard. I think that part of the reason why a lot of data journalism stories take so long to produce, even if the analysis in them appears to be quite simple, is because they take a long time to verify in a lot of different ways. So an example from a while back when I was at the LA Times, the big project I worked on there was an analysis of homeless arrests in the city of LA. So we had found that arrests of homeless people were going up significantly over the past 6 years, whereas overall arrests in LA were going down. And this was despite, the police rhetoric being that they weren't policing homelessness and homelessness is not a crime, et cetera. So this might be pretty simple. Like, we had a few bar charts and we had information showing like what the most frequently cited offense was, which was failure to appear in court. But it actually took several months to verify the information because we had all of the arrest data, but the question was, how do we determine who's homeless and who's not? And it's a long story, but like for the city of LA, the way that they usually coded people who were homeless was by giving them an address of 1942 Transient Way. I'm not going to get into why that's their classification. So then we used that as the indicator, but then we took the findings to the LA Police Department, who disputed those findings and said that it was an overestimate. And we went kind of back and forth on that. So I feel like, this kind of sounds corny or weird, but like in a way, similar to how like, well, I don't want to say that, maybe that's not true, but okay, I'll say it anyway. Like, when you write an academic paper, right, there's a lot of peer review that happens. And maybe you'll write the paper and it'll get published in a journal, and then people will respond to it, and you have a scholarly discourse over the course of several years or even like decades. With data journalism, it's kind of like that, except like the timeline is super condensed and the analyses might not be as sophisticated, but that kind of back and forth exchange between like your source, the players that you're accusing of something or shedding light on, kind of has to be like all in one story or a series of stories, right? You have to ask the police department to respond to these arrests data. That's, I think, what journalism is about. Like, it's about talking to the people behind the data and talking to the people responsible for the trends. And I think that maybe, even though there are a lot of similarities between data journalism and social sciences research, I think that's maybe one key difference. So I hope that answered the question.
That was a lot. I'm going to try to, there was a couple questions. There was a kind of a related question, I think came up in a chat and I have another one. So I'm going to try to bring you address. One question was, there was an article that someone found that relates to some of the biases that potentially show up in doing journalism. So I wanted to see if you had any opinions on, like, do you feel that's an issue? Like, you kind of walk through your process. And then related to that, there was a question as to whether or not, or what your thought is on, like, the general population's data literacy, and if that factors in how you present data or how you show your analysis, things like that.
So what was the article that, like, what were the main biases?
It looked like it was Allison Schrager's The Problem with Data Journalism. And then the quote was, in a perfect world, the data would just speak for itself, but that's never the case. Interpreting and presenting data requires making judgments and possibly mistakes. I worry that data gives commentary a false sense of authority, since data analysis is inherently prone to bias. So I think it was more just like your opinion on that.
Yeah, I definitely agree that at least like when data journalism was first, becoming like a big thing in people's minds, there was this kind of like valorization of data or quantitative analysis. There was this kind of thought that, like, if your story included some data analysis, it must be right, or it must be better than if it didn't. But the fact is, they're like, just like, stories without data, or any stories, data is prone to biases, and there can be things that are just really bad and wrong. Like, I showed like what I think are good examples of coronavirus graphics, but I think I don't know, probably for every good coronavirus graphic, there are like several bad ones. I've certainly seen a lot of misleading graphics out there, and I think it's hard because making a graph or doing an analysis gives people, like I said, this sometimes false sense that, like, because you like crunch some numbers, this is what makes things right. And I think that's why it's really important and incumbent on data journalists to explain the processes that they've used to come up with numbers and all of the assumptions that are baked into that. So that's why I pointed out like the GitHub pages that I've made that describe the data and code. So, if people are really interested, they can look for themselves and agree or disagree with the assumptions taken. And again, like I said, with the the New York Times versus the LA Times election maps, there's not really like a right answer sometimes. Like, sometimes it does involve judgment, right? Like, it does involve what you yourself, as the journalist, you kind of edit what you think is the most important thing to show. Like with the NYT, they were showing, they thought it was most important to show stuff on a neighborhood by neighborhood level and really understand places that are like islands of blue or red. With the LA Times, they felt like it was more important in the immediate aftermath of the election to give some kind of proportionally representative accounting of the results. Those are two different goals. And so I think that it is, I don't think there's a such thing as like quote unquote unbiased stuff. If anything, I think things that are done reflect, I think bias is a bad word, so I shouldn't say it. I think that analyses and stories that are written reflect news judgments of different people. And, by the way, that's why it's so important to have more diversity within journalism as a whole, and data journalism in particular, to have people who not only come from different backgrounds, but also who have done different kinds of jobs. Like, I haven't, prior to like 2016, I never worked in journalism before. And I see there are a lot of other data journalists who have a variety of professional and life experiences. And I think that those are assets that we bring to the table because we have different ways of looking at things. And literacy, oh yeah, data literacy. Yeah, the general population's data literacy, I think this is a big debate that that we think about, like especially when thinking through how to present like graphics. I think there have been a lot of like studies done on like, do people really understand scatter plots for the most part, yes or no? And like, if you show like a pie chart versus a bar chart, which will people say is most effective? And I don't really have a great answer on that, except to say that like sometimes you should give the audience a little bit more credit for understanding things. Like if I go back to one of my first slides here, this slide which was first done by my colleague John Byrne Murdoch in London. The y-axis, you'll notice, is on a log scale. So, maybe the conventional wisdom is that people don't understand log scales, and why should you do it this way? He chose to do it this way because the deaths from coronavirus are following an exponential trend. So to put it on a linear scale kind of distorts where different countries are relative to each other. And his point with making it on a log scale was partially so that people could look at their own country. I mean, at the time, the US was not here when he first made it. It was somewhere down here, but people could look at the US and compare the US's trajectory with that of other countries. If you put it on a linear scale, it would look like the US is way far behind in terms of coronavirus deaths than Italy or something. Like the first version of this graphic, but on a log scale, it takes into account the exponential increase. So like, if you said log scale, maybe a lot of people wouldn't understand what that meant. But if you show the chart in this way and explain, which he does in a really great video that I encourage you to watch. This is, by the way, this page is free to read, so that's really cool. It is a good tool for allowing people to understand how coronavirus is happening and unfolding. And I think, yeah, the New York Times also uses log scales. And I think they also have like a page that explains why they did it in that way. Yeah.
Cool. All right, 2 more questions. I asked the first one and then I'll let you answer. So who do you consider the Ida B. Wells of our time that focuses on social journalism? And then like, are there other data journalists that you would recommend that people follow? Who do you follow?
Yeah, oh God, who is the Ida B. Wells of our time, social data journalist? I have no idea. I don't know. I would say that like, I would say that there are a lot of actually like activist groups who have been promoting the use of data to make their arguments in similar ways as Ida B. Wells. There's a group called Data for Black Lives, which has done a lot of really interesting work. Most recently, I saw that they compiled a spreadsheet of all of the places in the US that were reporting coronavirus cases by race. Maybe some of you have seen the analysis showing that like coronavirus is disproportionately affecting areas with higher Black or African American populations. And so that's one that comes to mind. I think that there are so many data journalists that I personally admire. I couldn't really list them all. For political analyses, I really, because 538 was so inspirational to me in my career, I am a fan of Nate Silver and the types of work that 538 does to explain like the really detailed aspects of the election. Nate Cohn from the New York Times Upshot is also just an amazing data journalist that I think, focuses less on the prediction of elections, but more on the explaining of demographic factors relating to election results and why certain things happened the way that they did. I think like one of his analyses that I read recently was about like election results in Michigan for the primary, and he kind of made an argument that Bernie Sanders voters in 2016 who voted more for him than for Hillary Clinton, this time around, a lot of them maybe voted for Biden, and like for whatever reason, like maybe in 2016 it was less about voting for Sanders and more maybe about voting against Clinton. Now, this is a theory, but I think that in his research, he's backed it up with some data analysis. In terms of like visual journalism, actually, and this isn't necessarily like, I don't know, I feel like journalism is a nebulous term nowadays too, because like what's the line between like capital J journalism and like social science, data science, and whatever? Like, is everyone a journalist because they can communicate stuff? I don't know. But there's a website called The Pudding that does a lot of really amazing interactive graphics. I first came across them when I saw an analysis that they had done, I think this was back in 2016, about, they analyzed like women's speaking roles in movies. So in a lot of Hollywood movies, they went through like different scripts and analyzed like how much time women were speaking versus men. And it turns out that like most of the time it's men speaking and not women. And I thought that like that was a really interesting use of data. And I think that they've done a lot for broadening and diversifying the types of things that data journalism can cover. That's why I ended with the Lamar Jackson graphics, partially because I didn't want to end on a sad note, but also because I wanted to show that like data journalism isn't just like crime, politics, disease. It's also like, oh, what's your favorite song? Like, let's think about like, I don't know, a lyrical analysis of it, or, how many times are women speaking in movies, or, who are the rappers with the most diverse vocabulary? I think like a lot of those topics that wouldn't have normally been covered by data journalism are being expanded into, and I think the pudding is a key reason why that's the case.
That's cool. I looked at it real quick. So it looked pretty neat. So last question for you. So how would you suggest someone get started, or do you have any suggestions for people that aspire to be a data journalist?
Yeah, honestly, I think that a lot of this stuff you learn not because you're like taking a class or you're forced to or whatever, but because you have a question that's so interesting that you can't stop looking for the answer to it. And the only way you're going to get at the answer to it is by doing some kind of data analysis. And that might be a question that's not like a newsy topic or whatever. It might just be something that's of personal interest to you. But I bet if it's interesting to you, it's interesting to a lot of people. I remember like in I think it was 2018 when Anthony Bourdain died. So I was working in New York at the time. I wasn't doing a data journalism job, but I was still, of course, very interested in telling stories with data. I really liked Anthony Bourdain, the celebrity chef and author and TV star who traveled to different places around the world for his different TV shows. And I made like the weekend after he died, I started doing this like Netflix binge where I watched like all the episodes of No Reservations again. But I used my watching of that to make a spreadsheet of all the places that he traveled to on those shows. And I created like a map that had a point for every city that he traveled to. And it turns out that he traveled to a lot of different parts of the world. And I would like to think that even if I weren't in data journalism, I was I would have done something like that. Like you don't have to necessarily be a journalist to have an interesting idea or a theory that you want to test or something that you're so interested in and like so enthused by that you really can't like let go until you until you finish it or find a way to do it, right? Like if I didn't know how to map the points using GIS software, I probably would have learned it just to make that map because I was so interested in it. Amanda Cox, who is another person that I think should be followed, she's now the data editor at the New York Times. She once said that like the type of stuff that she does is stuff that like just keeps her up at night, and she's okay with like spending endless amounts of time doing it because it's so enjoyable and she just loves it so much. So I feel like getting into data journalism is kind of the same way. You start with doing stuff that you love and you care about a lot, and learning the skills are kind of like a means to the end of being able to tell the stories that you want to tell.
No, that was great. So I'm going to wrap it up now. Thank you, Christine. I think you did an amazing job. I think that was an awesome presentation. And I think the question and answer worked better virtually than it usually does in person. It gives you a little opportunity to pull up links and give thorough answers. So thank you. A couple of things just to wrap up. If anyone has feedback, please send it to me. I love to see if there's areas where we can improve the meetup. I'm going to try to do some others. O'Reilly, I've been working with some companies or folks to see if there's any free resources, and O'Reilly said that we can give away some free ebooks. So if some folks are interested, please just send me a message on Meetup. First couple folks, I'll introduce you and get you a free ebook from O'Reilly. And with that, I don't have anything else. Thank you, Christine. I hope everyone has a great Sunday. Happy Easter. Thank you for joining, and look to see you guys in the future. Stay safe.
Thank you.
Thank you.